In our last episode, we introduced our podcast and the topics we wish to cover. In today's episode, we'll delve deeper into the recurrent themes and tropes in prison literature around the world. We'll examine whether these themes are truly universal, look at examples and counterexamples, and see if there really exists something called prison literature as a genre. Might I add lastly that our inspiration for this draws from what we learned in Professor Prasananchu's class, analyzing themes in literature, like we did for Gandhiji's writing, and of course our favorite, the poem Law. Ananya, why don't you start with the first
Firstly, let's talk about the most prominent theme, loneliness and isolation. Isolation is of two kinds, isolation from members of civil society to protect them from criminals, and also isolation from other prisoners to avoid the harmful consequences of bringing together different convicts in one place. The second principle was introduced in the English model. The reason was that without it, prison would be a factory. People would work together and then retire to their cells. The element of punishment and reformation would be missing. Moreover, if criminals are free to communicate, they may form gangs and be a potential threat to the hierarchy of power established within a prison, even if only temporary. Isolation prevents this. Pulkit, do you think there are other so-called factors that isolation seeks to serve?
Uh, well, it's very interesting that you bring up this point of reformation because actually, when isolation was introduced, there's this concept of moral reform. As when someone's isolated in their cell, the concept is that they'll be forced to introspect and think about the crime, which is supposed to give rise to remorse. As a quote, placed alone in the presence of the crime, the prisoner learns to hate it. An example to this, in a rather very direct way, would be Oscar Wilde when he was petitioning to the Home Secretary to be released. To be released, and it almost feels like Wilde is quoting Foucault, just as I am about to quote Wilde when he says, "It is but natural that living in this silence, this solitude, this isolation from all human and humane influences, this tomb for those who are not yet dead, the petitioner should, day and night in every waking hour, be tortured by the fear of absolute and entire insanity. He is conscious that his mind, shut out artificially from all rational and intellectual interests, does nothing and can do nothing but brood on those forms of sexual perversity, those loathsome modes of eratomania that brought him here. From the high place and noble distinction to the convict cell and the common gaol." So here we sort of see that when he's alone in his cell, he's being forced to think about his crime of gross indecency because of which he ended up in here. So Nadia, do you think there are any problems with this aspect of moral reformation?
Yeah, so working on a model of punishing someone using isolation and trying to use it as a way to bring about moral reform or bring about remorse, it is flawed because it rests on flawed assumptions. So the first assumption would be that once a person has repented enough or has had enough remorse, this solitude and this isolation would stop weighing in on them. And this assumption in itself is also countered by Wilde in the same letter when he says, crimes may be forgiven or forgotten or forgiven, but vices live on. They make their dwelling house in him who by horrible mischance or fate has become their victim. They are embedded in his flesh. They become an essential part of the man. No remorse, however poignant, can drive them out. And so it really doesn't fulfill the aim that it sets out to accomplish, isolation that is. And I would say the second flawed assumption that this whole model rests on is that everyone in prison has something in the first place to regret. And this is simply not true, especially in the case of India. As we talked about in the last episode, we have a large under-trial population. And this includes potentially innocent people who, in a lot of cases, just don't have the financial ability to even secure bail and therefore have nothing to regret and have remorse about. And this punishment then becomes void of any reformatory meaning. It becomes rather brutal rather than seek the purpose of what should be a noble purpose of reformation. So it basically just gets reduced to state-sponsored violence. And there is, of course, always a possibility of wrongful convictions and a further, more harmful and very disparate impact on disadvantaged classes of society who are overrepresented in prisons and don't really get the kind of legal representation it takes to, fight their cases to fruition.
Yeah. And speaking about the overrepresentation of the underprivileged, this is a much broader sin in prisons. Prisons all over the world reflect society on the outside, albeit with a greater surveillance and social control imposed upon the prisoners. Now, data from our very own, that is NLU Delhi's very own Project 39A, reveals that people belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes of India and people with no literacy or post primary education are overrepresented in prisons. Now, while the factors for these are several, including lack of access to legal aid, one thing is for sure: they do not encounter an egalitarian world within the prison, where all prisoners are meant to be equal and subordinate to the guard. Instead, what do we see? We see alternate power structures which begin to develop within the prisons. Those who are powerful outside, they come to work in cahoots with the prison guards. Now, this implies that there's a continued prevalence of gangs within prison. For example, the Bloods, the Crips, the Latin Kings. This we've seen in the satirical show BoJack Horseman in countries like the USA and in Latin America. But in India, what do we see? We see more commonly caste-based hierarchies. For example, as we've seen in the book The Bad Boys of Bokaro Jail, powerful prisoners who belong to the upper castes and upper intermediary landowning castes in particular are richer on account of their caste privilege. They can smuggle in contraband materials into prisons, exercise some level of counter with the guards, and hence dominate the other prisoners due to the laxity and corruption which is prevalent in prisons. Now, Ananya, would you like to talk about the differences that we see though?
Right, Ayan. So basically, what happens is that we see there's some sort of distinction between India and between other countries. So in the USA, as you mentioned, these race-based gangs like Bloods and Crips, which were in their initial stages, they were dominated by members of the African American community, and Latin Kings, which is predominantly Hispanic. So these race-based gangs might recruit new members within prison, even those belonging to other races. And so over time, these members gain power even though they entered the prison without having any sort of social power or privilege. But in India, it's almost impossible for somebody to enter the upper echelons of prison without some pre-existing privilege. Furthermore, because a large portion of inmates spend years of their life within the walls of a prison, it becomes inevitable that some sort of social structure is slowly formed. And this one recognizes power, wealth, caste, and influence. So there's also a constructed system of justice that is developed by both the guards and the inmates. And this is informed by their own notions of morality and not any sort of objective mechanism. It's very subjective, and so they have the freedom to do whatever they want. And this isn't restricted or nor is it informed by anything objective. So Arun Ferreira, in his book The Colors of the Cage, he talks about how prisoners linked with different crimes are treated differently. And under trial prisoners who have been accused of rape are targeted with officers with special humiliating punishments. In the barracks, they're targeted by other prisoners with the encouragement of the staff. Ironically, the most righteous ones leading the attacks were often themselves rape accused or convicts. Those accused of murder were compelled to wear the uniforms of convict prisoners and consigned to special murder barracks. Prisoners accused of terrorism had jail superintendents personally preside over their punishments in a perverse display of patriotism. One prominent example of this that we see in popular media is from the Shawshank Redemption, where Andy Dufresne, who is wrongly accused of having killed his wife and her lover, is called names such as wife killer, and even as he's trying to do something good for the prison guard by giving him well-meaning advice, he's like totally othered and totally not allowed to speak, and in fact insulted even more. So it becomes that these prejudices and notions of right and wrong and perceptions of justice that people build over the years do not disappear once they step into the prison. So the prison isn't an egalitarian world. They continue to play a role in each prison's day-to-day life. Detailed instructions in prison manuals, elaborate laws, and theories of reformative justice, and these presumptions of like having to presume someone innocent until they are proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, all these largely remain on paper and allow us to remain complacent about the structures we have in place. Pulkit, would you like to elaborate about how this, how this deals with the abuse of power and brutality in prison?
Yes, Ananya, thank you. So it's very interesting when you were talking about how these caste privileges even play a role in prison, and how lower caste people get the short end of the stick even while inside prison, and as a result are abused, not just by prison guards but by their inmates, and maybe subject to brutality and violence. So this itself is a very recurring theme in prison literature. Writing about violence that takes place behind the bar, uh, Arun Ferreira only in his book gives a detailed account of the physical and psychological torture he was put through, but never names the police who put him through it. Now, why does he do this? It's because it's not these individual jailers or individual police personnel who are bad. It's not a case of a few bad apples, but it's this system of impunity and this whole system that is designed around allowing guards to brutalize prisoners that he wanted to draw attention to. So these he gives very detailed and gruesome accounts, and he sort of aims to connect with the reader and increase empathy and awareness, and which, if read widely as we believe prison literature should, and if it leads to enough of a social conscience within the society about the horrible conditions of brutality in a prison, may even lead to reform, which is one of the greater aims of the podcast we are doing today. Now, the purpose of violence used against inmates is many. Now, it may simply be to exact confessions, to falsely implicate people, like getting people to admit to crimes they haven't even committed. It might even be that a senior guard was simply reprimanded for not doing his job properly, and to take it out, he goes to a prisoner and brutalizes them. As a form of regaining his self-esteem and being able to establish a sense of control and being able to see himself as this quote-unquote macho man or a macho figure. So at prisons, the first instance of violence, especially for a first-time convict, is to assert dominance and set the tone for their next years. To set the tone for their next years. A common feature of all these instances of violence is an implicit understanding that exists between the police and the magistrates who are in charge of making sure a prisoner is physically unharmed. So it's sort of the magistrate and the police are in cohorts with each other. Like even though the laws on paper, as Ananya talked about, that they shouldn't be that prisoners aren't supposed to be brutalized by the police. But as we simply know that that's not the case. So what they develop these techniques of being able to anonymously brutalize prison guards, such as taking them to corners of a prison where there aren't CCTV cameras, ripping off their nameplates while they're trying to brutalize a victim, so that the names are not brought up if an inquiry is started, and that is if an inquiry is started. It's honestly pitiable that even till this date, there aren't prison cameras there aren't enough CCTV cameras in all prisons. And even when complaints are put forward, they are generally easily dismissed, because even the magistrate is in cohorts with the prison guards and the police personnel. So, and though, because to avoid getting media attention, or to avoid very indefensible charges of brutality, care is given not on whether to harm the victim or not, but where to harm the victim or not. So punishments such as whipping the soles of a person, it's very easy to get away with, because how often do you see the soles of the foot sole of a person, or let's say making them hang in their cells from their wrists. These wrist marks that handcuffs may cause can easily be brushed off as an accident or as a result of something else. But they just need to be small enough that the doctor and the magistrate can pass it off as an accident. So even when there's this conversation, like let's say a complaint comes up, and then this conversation starts between these three people, the magistrate, the doctor, and the prison guard, the real question isn't that whether the prisoner was brutalized or not. The real question is, how do we cover this up? right? Because they need to maintain these structures of powers. They need to stay in this kind of solidarity with each other, because it's the other person is the prisoner. There's no internal other between these three people. The other is the prisoner, and to brutalize the prisoner is one of the many things that prisons are notorious for, and guards feel it's their right to do it.
Yeah, and another very prominent way that abuse takes place inside of prisons is economically. So it's very common that prison guards misappropriate resources that are meant for prisoners. It's not a secret that these resources are already scanty and already poorly assigned. And even basic things like food, clothing, and something as basic as prison barber services are misappropriated. Often, since they are in a position of power, the guards that is, they can force the prisoners to pay a certain premium in order to avoid torture. So they basically use, threats of torture, and also get facilities meant for the prisoners. And this is also talked about in the book The Bad Boys of Bokaro Jail, where the author, who is from a management background, goes into depth about this illicit prison economy that has been set up, and especially in countries like India, where prisoners are not allowed to hold any amount of money. And another flip side of this corruption is that prisoners are also able to get contraband material, which are ultimately detrimental to their rehabilitation, like drugs and alcohol. And this has started to become a very widespread problem. And so, like, speaking about these kinds of abuse and the kind of brutality that these inmates face, another prominent theme that comes up in literature thereby is the resistance to this abuse and how prisoners react to what's happening to them. And so what happens is, in the face of all this pressure from guards, from co-inmates, and the situation that they're in, prisoners have one of the most prominent places that prisoners seek kind of solace and comfort is literature. All over the world, they resort to reading in prison libraries, and penning down their own thoughts through writing. And even the very act of writing, while there are guards and this entire system built to break you down and built to kind of shatter you mentally, just the act of writing in a system like that is an act of rebellion in itself. Conversely, some authors reverse the power, or attempt to reverse the power structures they are confined by through their literature. For example, whenever they feel like an injustice has been done to them, especially in the case of political prisoners who have been put in prisons for things like dissent, it is very common for them to kind of use their literature as the last resort to fight the last stretch of the fight that they had been attempting to fight in the first place. For example, Wole Soyinka, who was a political prisoner, saw himself as representing truth and his oppressors as untruth. He said about his jailer, and I quote, "This creature is irrelevant. He is not real. I represent reality." This is the same idea that others like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela also had while languishing in prison in their fight for truth and justice. And so literature becomes a means to assert any kind of identity, assert and find any kind of purpose when everything around you is structured to strip you of it.
Yeah. Nadia, you, Pulkit, and Ananya have really shown how hellish prison can be. Is there any form of escape that a prisoner can get, even temporary, from this? Well, visiting day is meant to be such an escape. So, visit rooms of a prison, they form a sort of temporary limbo. They act as a third space between two distinct worlds, which is the outside and the inside. And the rules of both worlds remain suspended here. So, these visits from friends, family, former colleagues, and so on give the prisoner a small window where they can regain a sense of familiarity, they can have a safe space to be heard, well, as safe as a room is in prison can be. Now, the article, The Emotional Geography of Prison Life, actually talks about this. So, the article speaks of prisons in terms of zones. These zones are divided according to emotional geography. These emotion zones demarcate areas where certain kinds of emotional displays are more or less acceptable. So, in the article, prisoners are interviewed, and these interviews reveal that emotional self control is frequently used as a protective tool within prisons. Prisoners will mask their very real feelings of fear, hurt, or grief in order to appear, well, not weak, in order to avoid that image of being, well, a weakling inside prison. There is some amount of such honest expression between friends and trusted inmates. However, even this is limited. Excessively unloading your intense emotions can be burdensome on even the most empathetic listeners, and it often brings back emotions, memories, and trauma that they themselves are trying to suppress. Now, against this backdrop, visiting rooms become an important safe space where you can express your taboo emotions. What taboo emotions? Well, warmth and tenderness, basically, and give voice to your frustration.
You're right, Ayan. But there's another aspect to it, and it's not as simplistic as it may seem when we watch representations of prison in popular media. So, in popular media or in literature by people who aren't or weren't convicts, these visiting days are shown as unequivocally positive experiences, which means, regardless of how the meeting will go, it's an opportunity for the prisoner to have some contact with the outside world, and hence it's shown as something very positive and uplifting. However, there's a deeper aspect to this. For prisoners, day means something more because before and after meeting their visitors, the prisoner is thoroughly searched, which may involve taking off all their clothes and having body cavity searches. So, this special day is also filled with humiliation for the prisoner of having their body searched, and also the fact of having your loved one see you in such a pitiable state, which also may evoke strong reactions from the prisoner and is not a positive experience. So there's a book which talks about this, which is Adam Reed's book, Papua New Guinea's Last Place, which is about the experiences in a post-colonial prison. So it documents the lives of inmates at the central prison in Papua New Guinea. When asked about letters and visits, the prisoners remained ambivalent, displaying mixed emotions. While they look forward to these days because they get to meet their loved ones, they also know that these visits have the potential to upset their composure and aggravate their worries. They long for news from the outside world, such as stories which remind them of their past and their positive experience in the past. The stories which remind them of where they're coming from, their background. But at the same time, it takes days after this to recover from that and set aside all these memories which they've seen or heard. The visits themselves also become difficult, with both parties trying to ignore the inevitable and difficult goodbye that is to come. Some prisoners, especially those who serve longer sentences, prefer to minimize these number of visits and avoid the emotional ups and downs that come with them. Pulkit,
Uh,
would you like to talk about the fact that prison hospitals, nutrition, and sanitation is also really bad, and how this is dealt with in literature?
that's a very pressing concern, especially in these times due to the insane world we are living in. I'm talking, of course, of the COVID-19 uh, pandemic. So prisons around the world actually became hotspots of COVID-19. And this is not a new news that the sanitation conditions and the food there and access to, let's say, washrooms or the status of prison doctors is bad. It's not new news. It's been very present and a very pressing concern within prison literature. So Oscar Wilde himself, while describing his cell conditions, mentions that the air comes through choked up gratings, which is far too small and too badly constructed to admit any adequate amount of fresh air one is breathing. For their entire time in prison, one is breathing the foulest possible air. Now, it's almost another form of torture, if you may, to keep inmates in these very highly unsanitary conditions and even restrict their access to toilets, as there are specific times during which a prisoner may go and use the toilets. Because Wilde himself, in another letter, while mentioning the facility of toilets, says that no prisoner is allowed under any circumstances to leave his cell after half past 5 p.m. So that includes for things like getting water if the water inside your cell finishes up, or using the washroom in the unfortunate circumstance that your cell does not. of course, have a toilet, which some cells now do have this particular aspect is now still somewhat better. It's still far from satisfactory. Because I'm about to quote Rasan Thomas, who is an inmate himself, and he actually wrote for this blog called the Marshall Project, which collects stories from people actually in prison. And this quote, I believe, very succinctly sums up the condition inside prison. And the quote is, "How can I eat like this for over a decade, sleep on thin mattresses over a metal bunk, and still be healthy?" Right? It's a very genuine and almost it's a rhetorical question, because of course, no one who eats prison food, which is highly rationed and isn't enough to, let's say, maintain diets of different kinds of people with different kinds of physiques. In fact, a lot of people go through insane weight losses while they are in prison, simply because they aren't able to digest the uh, food food properly. Uh, for example, these prisons, a lot of people have certain allergies, which prisons are very late to realize, or at least uh, late to respond to. So prison hospitals are also often criticized, with doctors being called callous and brutal, such as the above discussion we already have of brutality, where doctors are themselves in cohorts with prison guards. Who would like to trust doctors like these? So if, let's say, by some unfortunate circumstance you develop an infection inside a prison, you won't want to be treated by this doctor, and neither did Oscar Wilde while he was in prison. He mentioned that, "I have partially lost the hearing of my right ear through an abscess that has caused the perforation of the drum. The medical officer here has stated that he is unable to offer any assistance and the hearing must go entirely." So, and while commenting directly on prison doctors, Wilde mentions that prison doctors are usually, if not all, prison doctors have usually, if not always, a large private practice, and they hold appointments in other institutions, so they couldn't care less uh, about their patients inside prisons, as it doesn't pay as well in general also. So as a class, all of us can agree that doctors are by far one of the most humane professions present in the community. But prison doctors by inmates are often described as brutal in manner, coarse in temper, and utterly indifferent to the health of the prisoners or their comforts or their sanitary conditions. Even in present times, when prisons became a hotspot for COVID-19, some states in the United States of America had the audacity of still making prisoners buy soap for consumption and buy hand sanitizer, not just giving it to them. Right? Certain prisons in the US continue to charge prisoners for soap. Situations got so bad that inmates underwent the risk of getting caught by smuggling in phone cameras, by smuggling in phones with cameras and uploading the bad condition inside their prisons to social media. Right? Some prisons even resorted to placing inmates who are sick in solitary confinement, as they had no other place to quarantine them. Solitary confinement is one of the worst things that can happen to people in prison. And imagine being put under solitary simply for the reason that you got sick.
Right, and it is these problems and it is these structures that are in place that leads people to write in the first place. And when it comes to writing, and when it comes to writing from within prisons, we come to realize that prison writing in itself is inherently political. In a sense, it challenges these power structures. It recognizes the importance of bringing light to these issues. Researcher Larson finds two voices in a prison writer, one that is simultaneously personal and one that is political, the first being dissociative and the other associative. The prison writer writes about his experiences and their experiences as not an individual in prison, but as part of a larger community. And this larger community may be based on caste or race or cause. A political prisoner may refer to his fight for truth, but in doing so, he's actually referring to the whole movement and not just his fight and the cause at large. So at the same time, he's able to dissociate himself mentally from the prison to resist the kind of apparatuses of power that has been set in place, and kind of gain some kind of agency. And at the same time, he associates himself with a group to resist this very isolating power that the prison has on you, and connect the prison to wider injustices suffered by the group to which this prisoner ultimately belongs to. He may also at the same time speak about his family, which is an extremely personal thing. But due to the position he's writing from, the writing speaks back to the system that he's a part of. An example of this is Mandela writing about the death of his friend and his inability to attend that funeral. He remembers the various movements in which the recipient of the letter took part in. And just to read out a quote, I was very sorry to hear of the death of Percy. In all the important issues that we took up, you were always in the forefront, sharing common hardships with your friends and giving them encouragement and hope. Your humble contribution was made in the Defiance Campaign, Women's Protest March, and the Women's Protest March. By writing from inside prison, the technology of surveillance is in some way reversed, as the cell becomes a seat of judgment for the author then to comment on the injustice of prison and the quote unquote justice system that we have put in place. And so, yeah, that brings us to the end of this episode. Through this episode, we've tried to cover important themes that we have found while going through prison literature. We've gone through loneliness and isolation, the kind of power structures that are in place in prisons, the brutality that arise from these power structures, and the resistance to this brutality. We have talked about visiting day and the kind of sanitation conditions and its relevance in the times of this pandemic. And finally, we've tried to kind of contextualize why prison writing is the way it is. That is, it's both dissociative and associative. And so, yeah, we'll see you in the next episode where we kind of try to delve into how important writing from prisons is and its current legal state in our country and in the world at large. Thank you.